Tonight I'm talking about inequality, wealth, income, and poverty. Um, First, a couple of introductory remarks. Um, the first thing to say is that because of globalization of capital, capital as because of globalization of capital, it's now made it very difficult to discuss wealth and income inequality in just one country. Um, Capital now recognises no borders, as predicted by Marx more than a century and a half ago. Um, and this was elaborated on in the 1990s by the American neo Marxist Immanuel Wallerstein um, with what he called world systems theory. But I'm not going to go into that in any detail um, because I could do a whole lecture on that. But anyway, I first of all want to make a few important points about inequality before I start explaining the figures, how they've changed, and the consequence of those changes. Basically, things have got and are continuing to get more and more unequal since the 1970s. So, the first thing to say is that when we talk about social inequality, that simply refers to socially created inequalities between individuals. But all societies are stratified, though that's often very opaque. In other words, societies can be put into groups that have fairly common levels of income and wealth, fairly common lifestyles, and fairly common life chances. Um, Now, particular groups have some awareness of a common identity and a similar lifestyle, which often distinguishes them from other groups. So, traditionally in Britain, we've talked about working class, middle class, and upper class groupings who have a similar culture as well as, and partly a consequence of their inequality in wealth and income. So, in terms of the manifestation or consequences of stratified systems, the evidence is overwhelming that it matters. It matters in all sorts of ways in infant mortality rates, in education, in culture, in status, in political power, in criminal activity, in death rates, and so on. In virtually every area of social life from cradle to grave. Now, if we're going to try to measure these inequalities, we must be able to say what they are. In other words, we must be able to define those inequalities. Now, all sciences, and social science included, have to say precisely what it is they're measuring. So, let's start with what the difference is between income and wealth. Now, wealth is a stock of money, whilst income describes a flow of money. Having said that, it's often difficult to distinguish between the two. I mean, just think about the average person's current bank account. At the beginning of the month, just after their salary's been paid in, they might be flushed. But by the end of the month, before they get their next monthly paycheck, there will probably be much less money in their account. Now, is that money that's left in their account at the end of the month, is that income or wealth? And with the richest and highest earners, this problem becomes even greater. So, bearing this in mind, we're going to look at income distribution first. So, what counts as income? Well, um, Income can be measured both before and after taxes. We're all familiar with gross income and net income. And that's important because, in theory, tax rates are supposed to be progressive. In other words, the more you earn, the higher your tax rate is. However, unlike those on pay as you earn, which I guess is most of us, the highest earners employ corporate lawyers and accountants to minimize the tax they have to pay. And the higher the earnings, the more and better lawyers and accountants they can employ. So, in practice, we don't have a progressive tax system. In practice, we have a regressive tax system. In other words, the more you earn, the less tax you tend to pay. And although tax systems differ in different countries, this principle broadly holds true in every capitalist economy. But after tax, income is called disposable income. This is what a person has available for spending. But then there's another term, which is final income. Final income refers to income after taxes plus state benefits that are given in kind. So things like medical care and education. So when people talk about income, the first question we need to ask is, well, what do you mean by that? So, what is the best way of representing the inequalities in income distribution? We could say things like, well, the highest earning 1% or 10% or 30% have earned so much percentage of national income, and the lowest paid 10% earn so much of national income. But whatever percentage we use, we never get an overall picture this way. Now, there are things that economists use, and I was just talking to Claire at the beginning about my first degree was in economics and sociology. But I'm not going to bore you with too much economic theory, but there is a thing called the Gini coefficient. Um, One way to get a better overall picture is to use the Gini coefficient and look at the shape of that curve, which is called the Lorenz curve. Now, what the Lorenz curve is a graphical representation of the distribution of income, plotting the cumulative percentage of the population on one axis against the cumulative percentage of income or wealth on the other. And the Gini coefficient is the ratio of the area between the Lorenz curve and the equality diagonal, divided by the total area under the line of total equality. So that straight line across the middle would, if it was there, that would be total equality in a society. So the Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1, where a coefficient of 0 indicates perfect equality and a coefficient of 1 indicates perfect inequality, where just one person has all the income. Now, over the last 50 years, generally the Gini coefficient has become larger and larger. In other words, it's been getting more unequal. It rose rapidly during the Thatcher years between 1979 and 1991 because of cuts in the top rate of income tax and also because of business deregulation. It fell in the recession in the early 1990s as the highest earners were affected more than the lowest, but rose with the recovery of the mid to late 1990s. It fell again in the early 2000s as tax credits helped the lowest earners. It fell again following the financial crisis of the late 2010s, as once again the highest earners were affected proportionately more than the lowest earners. Since then, it's been gradually increasing and now stands at roughly 0.36. Now, this is a simplified version of the Gini coefficient. There are much more complicated formulae, but I'm not going to go into them. However, I don't think it really shows how much difference there is between societies because 0.2% represents a much more equal society and zero point 0.4 a very unequal society. But there are much more dramatic and interesting ways of representing the range of income inequality. And I want to look at one of those ways. And this is called Penn's Parade. Penn's Parade, or the income parade, is a concept that was devised in this 1971 book published by the Dutch economist Jan Penn to describe income distribution. Now, what he says in the book is what you've got to imagine is all 60 million adults in Britain standing in a straight line according to their income, with the lowest earners at the front and the highest earners at the back. Their respective heights represent their incomes relative to the mean average. So the average person would be about 5'8" tall. They then march past us in a parade, all 60 million in a parade over a period of 1 hour. So here we go with the parade. Now, at the beginning of the parade, the marchers can't be seen at all because they represent small businesses with losses. But very soon, upright marchers with positive incomes begin to pass by. But they are very tiny. For the first 5 minutes of the hour, these people are just a few inches tall. We're talking here about people like old age pensioners on the basic state pension. Between then and 10 minutes into the hour, they are mostly people without regular work. 10 minutes in, the full-time labour force arrives, and it lasts several minutes. They are now about 2 foot tall. They include a wide range of low-paid workers like home helps and cleaners, burger flippers, delivery drivers on 0 hours contracts, farm labourers, hospital porters, waiters and waitresses, school caretakers, office juniors and building labourers. There are so many of these low-paid workers that they keep on coming until about halfway through the parade. In other words, after 30 minutes of the hour, they are still only about 3 foot tall. But about halfway through the parade, the observers might have expected to be looking people in the eye. People of average height ought to be in the middle. But as I said, the marchers are still quite small. Then skilled workers start to arrive, like nurses, carpenters, bricklayers start arriving, but they're still mostly under 5 foot tall. 48 minutes in, and 80% of the population has passed before us before we reach average height. This is 12 minutes before the end of the parade. Then they start to increase. Police officers on average because it depends on their rank, of course, are 7 feet tall. Journalists, especially those working for national newspapers, are on average 8 feet tall. And university lecturers are on average 9 foot tall. Bearing in mind, of course, with regard to university lecturers, that salaries range from £25,000 a year for a newly qualified lecturer to £80,000 a year for some professors. Then they start to increase rapidly. Hospital consultants, lawyers, and senior civil servants are 20 feet tall. In the final 6 minutes, people with earnings in the top 10% begin to arrive, with heights increasing fast. We've got successful corporate executives, bankers, and stockbrokers are now peering down on the observers, from barristers at 50 feet tall, company directors of the top 100 companies at between 100 to 200 feet tall, and successful corporate executives, stockbrokers, and bankers, some at 500 feet tall. In the last few seconds, there's a glimpse of pop megastars, film stars, and the most successful entrepreneurs. And the observer can see only up to their knees. Above that is above the clouds. In the last few seconds, they have gone beyond the stratosphere and into outer space. In the last fraction of a second appears the tallest of the lot, whose heads have passed the moon. Remember that this is income, not wealth. At the very end of the parade in the original book in 1971 was a guy called Gerald Grosvenor. The soles of his shoes are hundreds of feet thick, and it was 4 miles to the top of his toe caps. So who is, or rather who was, because he passed away in 2016, Gerald Grosvenor? Gerald Grosvenor was the sixth Duke of Westminster. He earned 90,000 times the income of the lowest paid full-time worker that he employed on his estate. Now, why is this? Is it because he's very intelligent? Well, he gained just 2 O-levels, so not particularly intelligent. Perhaps he's just worked really hard all his life and has taken huge financial risks. Not really. Or is it a coincidence that he came from a long line of aristocrats? He was the sixth Duke of Westminster. Is it a coincidence that he went to a top public school, Harrow? And is it a coincidence that his father, the fifth Duke of Westminster, inherited large chunks of land and property throughout Britain, Ireland, America, and Australia, including 300 acres of Mayfair? And the sixth Duke of Westminster regularly commuted from his 13,000-acre family home, Eaton Hall, which is near Chester, to London in his own executive jet. His wife, Natalia, is godmother to Prince William. She is still alive. In other words, all I'm saying is it has nothing to do with intelligence or hard work. It is to do with his class background. This graph shows why the height of 80% of Britons was below the average. There was and is a tiny number of people who were and are colossal, bringing the average up to 5'8". And this tiny number of people is what we call the capitalist class. So don't compare yourself to nurses or doctors or university lecturers. It's this tiny 1% of people. Now, Penn's description could be applied to most countries, some with even more dwarfs, but even fewer but taller giants. But generally, over the last 50 years since the book was published, countries, including Britain, have become far less equal in terms of income distribution, as if it wasn't equal enough in the first place. The giants have become taller and the dwarfs have become smaller. This is the United Kingdom, but it's worth putting this in a global context. Um, the giants of 1971, who were measured in miles, have been replaced by figures measured in light years if we scaled it to global averages. In 1971, the top earners were colossal. Today, income at the 99.99th percentile has risen by over 600% in real terms since 1971, whilst the median average has stagnated. So, in global terms, modern updates by organisations like the Centre for Global Development illustrate that today's billionaires, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who I'll talk about a bit more in a little while, would be millions and millions of feet tall. So that's income distribution. But in terms of income distribution, global inequalities are even worse. Even the poorest in the developed world have standards of living far better than the majority of the world's population. So even the people that we would call living in poverty in Britain have living standards far better than the majority of the world's population. Half of the world's population live on less than $1 a day. Inequalities between the West and the rest are growing, especially between the West and most of Africa. The richest 20% of the global population receives 80% of the world's income. And the poorest 20% of the world's population receives just 1% of the world's income. That doesn't mean to say that in those countries, those poor countries, everyone is impoverished. On the contrary, inequalities in wealth and income tend to be greater the poorer the country. So, for example, in Madras in India, there are some households that have several servants, a gardener, and a chauffeur, whilst others are literally starving. So, that's income distribution. Let's go on to wealth distribution. Now, if you thought income distribution was unequal, when it comes to wealth, distribution is even less equal. Now, wealth refers to the monetary value of physical and financial assets that a person has inherited or been able to accumulate from income and other sources. So it includes not just money in the bank, but also buildings, homes, factories, art treasures, machinery, and other assets. Personal wealth is difficult to assess because there's no wealth tax on the living. Some of us think there ought to be. There has been a call for a 2% wealth tax from the left since Labour came to power. There are estate duties on the deceased, but these are often avoided by putting wealth into trusts at least 7 years before death to pass on to family members, as we'll see. The other thing is, should the individual be the unit of measurement? Because wealth is often owned by families or households, especially amongst the very rich. So that's a problem. Now, also, how do we know how much wealth people have? So, for example, we only know how much certain assets are worth when they are sold. So, to give you an example, think about the newspaper title, The Sun. How much is it worth? We'll only know if and when it is sold once Rupert Murdoch dies. He'll probably leave it to his offspring, and the state will have to decide how much it's worth. And as I said, with regard to income, the richer people are, the more they want and are able to conceal the extent of their worth, their wealth. So the extent of inequality in wealth distribution is always an underestimate. Not only is wealth difficult to measure, it's also difficult to define precisely what should be measured. Should we measure what's called marketable wealth? Um, Land, shares, artwork, things you can sell, in other words. Or should we include what's called non-marketable wealth? So, for example, I own my own home. Um, should that be included in wealth? Because it's not marketable in the sense that if I sell it, I've only got to buy somewhere else to live. Also, things like the value of occupational pensions, should they be included in the measurement of wealth? So there are a lot of difficulties in measuring wealth. Also, the figures are misleading because the official figures fail to distinguish wealth used to finance production or speculation and personal wealth. So, for example, as I said, house ownership is included in the figures, and home ownership has gone from 30% of households to 70% in um, the last 50 years. And but as a homeowner, increases in house prices don't benefit me because if I sell it, I have to pay more for somewhere else to live. Yet, including home ownership in assets makes the distribution of wealth appear more equal. In any case, a large proportion of personal wealth is mortgaged housing. The value of occupational pensions, having risen dramatically, also makes it seem more unequal. But power derives mainly from the ownership of marketable wealth. We will see later how power is exercised by the wealthiest. And also, inequality in wealth is perhaps even more difficult to measure than income distribution because it's more easily disguised. The rich may be unwilling to reveal their actual wealth, much of which may be hidden in overseas tax havens. One particular review, um, uh, the Deaton Review, argued that all this means that the figures are undoubtedly a gross underestimate of inequality in wealth distribution. The Deaton Review, which was an independent body drawing on a variety of sources, looked at wealth inequality over time and came to that conclusion. And wealth was becoming more equally distributed between 1900 and 1980. But since 1980, the Thatcher years and after, this trend has gone into reverse. So it was getting more and more equal up until 1980, but now since then it's been getting more and more unequal. Most wealth is in the hands of a small minority in Britain. 1% own 25% of all wealth, and 10% own 54% of all wealth. So official figures show that the top 1% of households have wealth exceeding 3.6 million each, while the bottom 10% of households have wealth of £15,400 or less. In other words, the wealth at the top 1% is around 233 times higher than at the poorest 10%. And share ownership is particularly important because by and large it finances production. 92% of the British population own no shares at all, and the vast majority of the 8% that do have shares have no influence on over the way the companies that they have shares in are run. There was an increase in the percentage of the population owning shares in the late 20th century, but this was due mainly to government privatizations. You know, people were encouraged to buy shares and employees were given shares in privatized companies. Also, the demutualization of former building societies, you know, they all became private companies. But most of these shares were soon sold off and found their way back into the hands of large institutions and financiers. So most privately owned shares remain in the hands of a tiny minority of the population. The Office for National Statistics carries out a wealth and assets survey, and bases its estimates of the distribution of wealth on its wealth and assets survey. The most recent one took place between 2020 and 2022. The 32,200 people were interviewed either face to face or by telephone. The survey relies on the accuracy of responses and the representativeness of the sample, and so it can't be regarded as completely reliable. In this survey, the wealthiest 1% had wealth of £3 million or more. The least wealthy 10% had £16,500 or less. The wealthiest households were in the 65 to 74 age groups. They had a median household wealth 33 times higher than for the least wealthy, who are concentrated in the 16 to 24-year-old age group. The Gini coefficient for wealth distribution is 0.59, so it's much higher than for income distribution, which is 0.36 for income distribution. So wealth is increasingly important relative to income as a source of inequality. So research that concentrates on income inequality without taking account of wealth inequality underestimates the degree of inequality. So bear that in mind when people talk about income inequality. Also, the number of ultra rich is, however, still small, but their wealth is enormous. And according to many sources and a lot of research, it's growing rapidly. One of the sources that you can look at is the Sunday Times Rich List. Each year, um, the Sunday Times produces a rich list, and the one for 2026 isn't available yet. But given all the problems of estimating, excuse me, wealth distribution, one of the most authoritative guesstimates of the wealthiest families and individuals in Britain is provided by the Sunday Times newspaper. It lists the richest 350 individuals and families in Britain. And this 350 represents 0.0005% of the population. Despite the claim that the ultra rich contribute greatly to the economy, much of the wealth is actually inherited, and it is increasingly produced from financial sources, which create large flows of passive income, in other words, non-work income, from sources such as rent and interest payments. In other words, they don't contribute anything to the UK economy. And this leads to the direct transfer of wealth from those on low and moderate incomes to the already rich. Since the ultra rich have large amounts of surplus income, this tends to be reinvested by buying assets like government debt, land, housing, and shares. And this in turn forces up prices, which in London, for example, are now out of reach, even for many relatively well paid middle class people, forcing them to rent from private landlords. This further forces up rents, making it more difficult to save for a deposit and ensuring that the cycle continues. Furthermore, the interest on government debt repayments limits government spending and its ability to support the living standards of those on low incomes. Now, Gary Stevenson, Gary Stevenson argues this is creating the conditions for authoritarian populist governments to blame stagnating living standards on ethnic minorities and immigrants. Sound familiar? And Stevenson is one of the many voices calling for a wealth tax. Critics argue that this would just lead to the ultra-rich going abroad and tax revenue falling, as we have seen many individuals registering in Dubai in recent years to avoid tax. However, there are ways of stopping this happening. Um, Now, the top 10 in the Sunday Times Rich List are worth over £200 billion. That's each. This is a £25 billion increase, or 14% in 1 year. This has happened at the same time as cuts to benefits have taken place, of course. The number of billionaires has increased from 15 in 1990 to 156 in 2025. At the same time, food bank use is at a record level. There were only a handful of food banks in the whole country in 1990. Now there is one in virtually every town and several in every city in Britain. I never thought I'd see the day when we had a food bank in Lakenheath, but we've had one now for 10 years. The 350 richest individuals and families have a combined wealth of 772.8 billion. That is more than the GDP of countries like Belgium, Argentina, or Ireland. The 50 richest families have more wealth than half of the population. And over half of total billionaire wealth comes from property, inheritance, and the finance sector. In other words, not from production. Over half of it. So it's a drain on society. It doesn't contribute to society. So let's have a look who's on the Sunday Times rich list. Well, top of the list for the fourth year running is this guy. He has a fortune worth 37 billion. He's the owner of the Hinduja group of companies. Now, I don't mean to be patronising to you, but in case you think 37 billion is not that great, here it is in numbers. That's how much 37 billion is. Um, there are some more familiar names on the list. Um, so, for example, Sir James Dyson is fourth on the list with 20.8 billion. He, of course, made his fortune from developing the bagless vacuum cleaner. Then there's Jim Ratcliffe. He's CEO of the Ineos Chemicals Group. He has a fortune of 17 billion and is seventh on the list. He's probably better known to some people as the co-owner of Manchester United. And since he took over the club, he's sacked over 200 staff. And then there's Hugh Grosvenor, the seventh Duke of Westminster, who took over from the sixth Duke of Westminster. He's 14th on the list. So, as I say, he is, of course, son of Gerald Grosvenor. And after his father died in 2016, he inherited not only his title as 7th Duke of Westminster, but also his fortune of £10 billion. Of course, he paid no tax on his inheritance because of the tax loophole that allowed his father to put all his wealth in a trust for Hugh more than 7 years before he died. Now, the interesting thing for me is I worked it out. If he had paid tax on the inheritance, it would have been enough to fund the shortfall in NHS funding for a year, and it wouldn't have made any material difference to his lifestyle. Rishi Sunak and his wife, Akshata Murthy, are ranked joint 238th on the Sunday Times rich list with a combined wealth of 640 million. Remember that this is the man who, when he was Chancellor and later Prime Minister, argued that Britain was broke and that austerity cuts for the poorest were necessary. And if you think about the amount of money he's got, 640 million, if he invested that wealth at a minimum of, say, 5% interest, I mean, usually they get greater interest than that. at a minimum of 5% interest. That would give him £32 million a year to live on. That's for producing absolutely nothing and contributing nothing to the economy. In other words, like others, he is what is the biggest drain on the economy. However, it needs to be borne in mind, as I said at the beginning, that many British assets are now owned by billionaires based overseas, sometimes by foreign governments, sometimes by financial institutions. The £37 billion fortune of the Hinduja um, group is chicken feed when we come to consider the wealthiest in the world who have roughly 10 times this amount of wealth. Every year, researchers working for the business magazine Forbes are tasked with the job of calculating how much wealth the world's billionaires have. Their wealth is cited in US dollars. And each year, Forbes employs a team of over 50 reporters from a variety of countries to track the activity of the world's wealthiest individuals. It excludes any ranking of those with wealth that is not able to be completely ascertained. It's based on their documented assets and accounting for debt and other factors. Surveys are sent to those who may qualify for the list, and they get back three types of responses. Some people try to inflate their wealth. Others cooperate but leave out details, and some refuse to answer any questions. Business deals are then scrutinised and estimates of valuable assets are made. Interviews are then conducted to vet the figures in order to improve the estimate of an individual's holdings. On a date roughly a month before publication, since stock prices fluctuate rapidly, an individual's true wealth and ranking at the time of publication may vary from their situation when the list was compiled. So, when a living individual has dispersed his or her wealth to immediate family members, it's included under a single listing as a single family fortune, provided that the individual is still living. However, if a deceased billionaire's fortune has been dispersed, it will not appear as a single listing, and each recipient will only appear if his or her own total net worth is over £1 billion. So, this is the top 10 for last year. If you include Elon Musk, who of course came from South Africa originally, 8 of the top 10 are American. The richest person on the planet, Elon Musk, who owns Tesla, SpaceX, and X, which was formerly Twitter, was estimated by Forbes to have a fortune of 389 billion. There's some estimates that put it at more than 1 trillion, in other words, 1,000 billion. Yet from 2024 to April 2025, he was employed by President Trump to cut US government spending. He famously came on stage at a Trump rally wielding a chainsaw to symbolize the massive cuts he was going to make. One of the cuts was to the US overseas aid budget, which provides support to some of the world's poorest children. The symbolism of the world's richest man introducing policies to deprive some of the world's poorest children of aid illustrates all too graphically that wealth inequality has got totally out of hand and is underpinning numerous global problems, even though they are based overseas. Businesses like Amazon and Facebook that are owned by the ultra rich do a huge amount of business in Britain, but pay a tiny proportion of their turnover and profits in tax in Britain. So now I've given you an idea of the wealth and income of the richest. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Although world poverty is obviously a very important issue, it would take a lot more than one presentation to deal with that. So I'm only going to talk about Britain. In fact, even dealing with British poverty in Britain, I can only really deal with the problem of defining it in a short session like this in order to allow a little bit of time at the end for discussion. I want to start with this. The issue of definition is quite important because, for example, when Labour came to power 2 years ago, two of the first policies they pursued were very controversial. The first one was the two-child benefit cap. The second one was the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. Firstly, despite opposing the Tories' imposition of a two-child benefit cap when in opposition, they decided to keep it and whipped all Labour MPs to vote for it. Now, the Child Poverty Action Group estimated that if the cap had been scrapped, an additional 290,000 children would have been taken out of poverty. Secondly, Age UK estimated that approximately 60,000 pensioners who were previously not living in poverty would fall into poverty due to the scrapping of the winter fuel allowance for all but the poorest pensioners. Now, it's got to be said that despite opposing this move, Tory MPs, such as the Tory party leader Kemi Badenoch, were proposing ending the winter fuel allowance when the Tories were in government. So I think that both major parties were disingenuous. Then, in her spring statement last year, the Chancellor announced cuts to welfare, which the BBC said would plunge an extra 250,000 people into relative poverty. Now, no phrase relative poverty, which I'll deal with in a while. However, the main point I'm going to make here for sociologists like me is where these figures come from. Where do these figures of 290,000 children, 60,000 pensioners, and 250,000 claimants come from? How were these figures arrived at by the Child Poverty Action Group, by Age UK, and by the BBC? And the question really is about how and where do we draw the poverty line below which we determine that someone lives in poverty? This question is also pertinent since the Labour government has set up a cross-party child poverty task force claiming that childhood poverty has increased by 700,000 since 2010 when the Conservatives came to power and now stands at more than 4 million children. Again, how were these figures arrived at? Well, how does the government define poverty? Until 1999, the UK government didn't recognise an official poverty line. Most other European countries did, but British governments preferred to use a range of separate indicators of deprivation, like eligibility for certain state benefits. So it was difficult to estimate numbers. Most EU states defined poverty as living in a household with an income on or below 60% of the national median household income. By median, we mean that income that is uh, where half of the population is below and the other half above that figure. And this was usually after direct taxes, but excluded household costs. Um, this definition was eventually adopted by the British Labour government from 1999 onwards. This was in an attempt, the Blair government argued, to have child poverty to halve child poverty within a decade and eliminate it entirely within 20 years. An ambition that certainly wasn't achieved, not least because government policy changed in 2010 after the Conservatives came to power. However, most sociologists have regarded this as an extremely crude measure that doesn't take account of different circumstances. Circumstances like the type of household. Is it a small flat or a large house? Doesn't take account of age-related needs. Doesn't take account of how many children in the household. The area of the country, the cost of living is higher in London than in many other parts of the country. Doesn't take into account travelling costs to get to work. Bear in mind that the majority of those in poverty are the working poor, even more so since the expansion of the so-called gig economy. Doesn't take into account the clothes that people might need for work, and so on. Doesn't take into account so many different things. It's just a bare figure. So sociologists generally think that it would be better to decide who is in poverty by adopting the idea that being poor means not being able to afford the things you need, not the things you want, but the things you need for a decent life. And surveys demonstrate that this is consistent with the view that's held by the general public. But what are the things that people need? And how do sociologists approach this question? Now, sociologists have traditionally distinguished between two different types of poverty: absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is based on the idea of subsistence. People are in poverty if they don't have enough resources to maintain human life properly, in particular, food, clothing, and shelter. Whereas relative poverty, supporters of the concept of relative poverty argue that any definition of poverty must relate to the standards of a particular society at a particular point in time. The dividing line that separates the poor from everyone else will therefore vary according to how affluent a society is. So let's have a look at the difference in more detail, starting with the notion of absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is measured in terms of resources required to maintain health and physical efficiency. In other words, the quality and amount of food, clothing, and shelter deemed necessary for a healthy life. And it's usually limited to material deprivation. But the United Nations has a definition of absolute poverty as follows. One of the things you should note about this definition is that it does go a little bit further than absolute poverty in adding education and information as well as access to services. And one common approach to absolute poverty is called the budget standard approach. This involves calculating the cost of these purchases necessary to raise an individual or family out of poverty. In the late 19th century, there were a number of studies of absolute poverty, especially by Henry Mayhew. In the 1840s, the journalist Henry Mayhew observed, documented, and described the state of the working class in London in a series of articles in the Morning Chronicle. These articles were later compiled into this book, which has got 3 volumes in 1851, entitled London Labour and the London Poor. Using interviews, it was an extremely detailed study of the lives of thousands of Londoners. Although he tried to make numerical estimates of the number in poverty by using other information like census data and police statistics, the interviews were the main focus of the book. So, whilst the book describes how marginal and precarious many people's lives were in what was at the time perhaps the richest city in the world, much of the book is anecdotal, and the study was a narrative, emotive, and journalistic one. Charles Booth's studies of London in the 1880s his studies were much more scientific. Booth was a positivist. In other words, in studying social issues like poverty, he argued that we need to try to replicate the methodology and logic of the natural sciences by defining our subject matter and terms as precisely as we can before measuring them. Booth's studies of London's poor influenced government policy in the 20th century and helped initiate old age pensions and free school meals for the poorest children. And Booth is best known for his multi-volume book Life and Labour of the People in London that was published in 1902. It focused on the statistics he collected regarding poverty in London. He's commonly regarded as initiating the systematic study of poverty. Booth was critical of the existing statistical data that was found in census returns on poverty. Due to the scale of the research involving numerous researchers, it took Booth over 15 years before the full 17-volume edition was published. It can be regarded as one of the founding texts of British sociology, drawing on both quantitative, that is, statistical methods, and qualitative methods, particularly ethnography that describes people's conditions. And his study showed that 35% of those in East London in particular were in poverty. And he popularised the idea of a poverty line and set this line at 10 to 20 shillings a week, which he considered to be the minimum amount necessary for a family of 4 or 5 people to subsist on. Booth also mapped the whole of London street by street, showing by colour coding where the most deprived areas were. His researchers visited households in every street in London, And this is part of Booth's map of Whitechapel in 1899. The red areas are well-to-do areas. The black areas are what he called semi-criminal, and the orange areas are somewhere in between. Um, for the purposes of poverty measurement, Booth divided the working population into 8 classes, from the poorest to the most well-off, labelled A to H. These categories summarised economic circumstances, but also had a moral dimension, with A representing what he called the feckless, deviant, and criminal groups. Booth's maps were based on observations of differences in lifestyle and focused on qualitative factors like food, clothing, shelter, and relative deprivation. In other words, relative to more well-to-do people in London. So his definition of poverty was explicitly relative rather than absolute, and his work is commonly bracketed with the work of the Rowntrees, who we'll look at in a moment. But his methods were quite different from Rowntree's methods. His poverty line was used as an indicator of poverty, not a definition. He based the description of poverty on class rather than income. He didn't attempt to define need nor to identify subsistence levels of income on the basis of minimum needs. Booth used school board visitors to collect information on the circumstances of families. His approach was to identify the sorts of conditions in which people were poor and to describe those conditions in a variety of ways. His definitions of the poverty levels of households were generally descriptive, which didn't equate to specific criteria. However, his projection from these findings to families without school-age children was speculative rather than scientific. Although the 17 volumes were dense with often fascinating detail, it was primarily descriptive rather than analytical. Booth's work served as an inspiration for Rowntree. However, even though Rowntree's work draws on Booth's investigation, many commentators on poverty generally turn their attention towards Rowntree's work because his studies clearly address the problem of defining a subsistence level of poverty. Using a more scientific method of defining and measuring poverty that comes closest to an absolute material or subsistence definition, Seaborn Rowntree, who was a Quaker philanthropist and, as you've probably guessed, a famous chocolate maker, carried out studies of poverty in York over a 50-year period. Starting in 1899, his first study was published in 1901, again in 1936, and finally in 1950. In the initial study, he drew a poverty line in terms of a minimum weekly sum of money, in his words, necessary to enable families to secure the necessaries of a healthy life. And these are the things that he said were necessary for a healthy life. And the amount needed he adjusted according to family size. In the 1936 and 1950 studies, however, he included allowances for some extra items that were not strictly necessary for survival. Items like newspapers, books, radios, beer, tobacco, holidays, and presents. But despite adding these items, he found that absolute poverty or destitution had actually fallen from 33% in 1899 to 18% in 1936 to only 1.5% of the population of York by 1950. Why was this? Especially as Britain was still suffering severe economic shortages and a programme of austerity just after World War II in 1950. Well, I've talked about this in earlier talks, so I won't dwell on it too much. But the reason was that during the war, Lord Beveridge was commissioned to write a report on what was needed to rebuild Britain after the war. He reported in 1942 and said that these were the things that needed to be tackled. As a result of this research, he declared that there were these five evil giants. Um, the idea was to offer the British people a safety net from the cradle to the grave. And this was adopted wholesale by the Labour Party in their manifesto for the 1945 general election. And as I've already said, they won a landslide and set up the first ever majority Labour government. And they then set about tackling these five giants. The NHS was set up in 1948. The tripartite system of education was set up that gave children from working class backgrounds the chance to get a proper secondary educational merit. They embarked on a mass house building program of council houses that continued until the 1970s and built several new towns to take working class people from the slums to new modern homes. They brought in a system of social security for all workers that included sickness and unemployment benefit, maternity benefit, old age pensions, death grants, and so on. It really was from cradle to grave. And full employment, apart from a few pockets here and there, was achieved by nationalising the commanding heights of the economy. They set up labour exchanges designed to place the unemployed into work, and they adopted a Keynesian demand management economic strategy to ensure full employment. Labour won the 1950 election, but with a vastly reduced majority. They then lost the 1951 election to the Conservatives, who went on to rule for 13 years. There's a lot of reasons for that I've already suggested in an earlier talk. However, as One Nation Tories, during the 50s, the Conservative Party more or less continued with Labour's approach, which was dubbed welfare capitalism, or Butskelism, as I said in that earlier talk. This resulted in an unprecedented growth in affluence to the extent that by the late 50s, the Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan declared, "You've never had it so good." By the end of the 50s and early 60s, most people were buying televisions, fridges, washing machines, gramophones, telephones, cars, and so on for the first time. Consumerism had really taken off. We were living in the so-called affluent society. People were going on foreign holidays, drinking wine, and so on. It was assumed by most people that the welfare state had virtually eliminated poverty. However, not everybody was enjoying the good life. There was the so-called rediscovery of poverty in the 1960s. It was because sociologists started to question the idea that poverty had been eliminated. They started to argue that poverty should be measured in terms of the standards specific to a particular place at a particular time. Defining poverty in relative terms meant that certain things were moving from being luxuries to being comforts to being necessities. So, for example, how could anyone in this modern Britain be considered not to be in poverty if they couldn't afford a fridge and a washing machine? Therefore, any definition of poverty, it was argued by these sociologists, must be related to the needs and demands of a changing society. And many sociologists also thought that it wasn't sufficient to continue to see poverty simply as a lack of material possessions and the facilities necessary for material well-being. Poverty also exists where members of a society are excluded from the lifestyle of the community to which they belong. So the notion of social exclusion should be included in any definition of poverty as well. This rediscovery of poverty was exemplified by a television drama. Kathy Come Home was a 1966 BBC television play written by Jeremy Sanford, produced by Tony Garnett, and directed by Ken Loach. It was watched by over 12 million viewers, a quarter of the British adult population at the time. Its hard-hitting subject matter, poverty and homelessness, and highly realistic documentary style shocked the nation. In a Radio Times poll in 1998, it was voted the best single television drama, and a 2000 industry poll rated it as the second best British television programme ever made. In 2005, it was also named by the publication Broadcast as the UK's most influential television programme of all time. The charity Shelter was set up within days of the first broadcast, followed by the charity Crisis the following year. The Child Poverty Action Group had been established a year earlier, but its influence became massively greater after Kathy Come Home was aired. I've got a copy of it on DVD at home here. A founding member of the Child Poverty Action Group was the sociology professor Peter Townsend. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, he campaigned tirelessly to highlight the continuing existence of poverty and enforcing the issue back onto the political agenda. He was the leading supporter of defining poverty in terms of relative deprivation. And I was lucky enough to go to some of his later lectures in the 90s. In 1969, 68 to 69, using questionnaires, Townsend and his researchers conducted a social survey of 2,052 households containing 6,098 individuals in 51 parliamentary constituencies in Britain. He devised what he called a deprivation index that covered a total of 60 specific items of deprivation. From the initial list of 60, after the researchers brought back the survey results, he selected 12 items from the information collected from households that he believed would be relevant to the whole population and calculated the percentage of the population that would be deprived of them. His findings were finally published in this book in 1979. However, Townsend's deprivation index was highly criticised as A, not reflecting the public's attitudes, and B, not being clear what each one has to do with poverty, as well as how they were selected. So, for example, going without a Sunday joint or not eating fresh meat or cooked meals might very well reflect social and cultural differences. What if someone chooses to eat salads and uncooked breakfasts? Townsend didn't attempt to discover whether it was choice or shortage of money which led to people scoring points on his deprivation index. So, responding to these criticisms, in the 1980s, London Weekend Television financed a study of poverty by Joanna Mack and Stuart Lansley. Mack and Lansley surveyed a sample of 1,174 people across Britain, and they defined poverty as an enforced lack of socially perceived necessities. The 1985 book, Poor Britain, is based on their 1983 Breadline Britain survey, which used a consensual approach to determine the necessities required for a decent standard of living. In other words, reacting to the criticisms of Townsend's work, they asked respondents to name things that they thought nobody should have to go without because they couldn't afford them in modern Britain. In other words, the public decided what were necessities. And there was a large degree of consensus about what items were regarded as necessities. And they decided then to assume that an item became a necessity when more than 50% of their sample thought it was a necessity. And this left them with 22 items. They then asked respondents to name things from the list that they had to go without, not by choice, but because they couldn't afford them. Those who lacked 3 or more items because they couldn't afford them were considered poor. They estimated that 5 million adults and 2.5 million children were in poverty in Britain. And as you can see from this chart, they did a follow-up study in 1990 using the same methodology and found, and I've indicated them there, 4 more things on the list that were then by 1990 regarded as necessities. In other words, more than 50% of respondents thought that they had become necessities. The 1990 study, this is after a decade of Thatcherism, of course, also showed that there had been a big increase in poverty from 7.5 million to 11 million. Using exactly the same methodology, David Gordon and his colleagues carried out a further study in 2000. The major difference was that they determined that someone only had to lack 2 rather than 3 of the items that more than 50% of the population determined were necessities that nobody should have to go without because they couldn't afford them to be considered living in poverty. And these were the items that they asked people to tick, which ones they thought. So there's a list running to 2 pages, whether they thought these things, which of these things people should be able to afford, otherwise they lived in poverty. I'm not going to go through them, but that's the list there. Um, and I won't ask you to do it, but if you look at the recording, because we haven't really got time now, if you look at the recording, you'll be able to go through the list and tick the things that you think are necessities. I mean, some of them have become redundant now since 2000. Um, but also, in addition to that, um, those were the items on this side that they thought that people thought were necessities. That's the percentage of people. And that's the items in 2000 that they thought were not necessities. But you should really ignore that for the moment if you're going to do it yourself after the talk. But lastly, there's one other question I want to pose, and that is, in today's world, is there such a thing as data poverty? Now, 6.8 million households struggled to afford communication services in July 2024. The O2 recently ran an advertising campaign to help those who are suffering from what they call data poverty. And these statistics are taken from Ofcom reports, from the minimum digital living standard research by Virgin Money and by information provided by Refuge. 3.7 million households with children do not meet the minimum digital living standard. 4 in 10 households with children in the UK, that is. 29% of people know someone disconnected from the internet. And also 16% of the UK experience economic abuse, which can include restricted access to services or devices rather, meaning barriers aren't always straightforward. So should data poverty be included in any definition of poverty? So there you are. I've left you with some issues to discuss, and I've gone on far too long. So thank you for your patience.